Hi all, welcome to the Scottish Regional Industry Group event. Today I'm just waiting, we can see people are still logging in, so we're going to give them a couple of minutes just to get everyone on and then we will start. We are recording today, so if there's anything that or anyone that doesn't feel that they want to be part of the recording, please if you could let me know in the chat. Alternatively, we will record and make that available following the end of the event on the regional group. So just a couple of minutes as we've got the flutter of people joining and we'll get started. Can someone just let me know if they can see my slides?
Yep, we can see your slides.
Fantastic. Okay, so it seems to have kind of settled now, so I'm going to get started. And I'm going to just move this so I can see my own slides, which would be good. So first of all, it's not working for me. So first of all, thank you and morning and welcome to all that have joined us at our virtual web event today. This is, I think, a fourth or fifth event, so hopefully we're getting used to the software and getting started and working through this really quickly. Today we've got two kind of presentations from Ellie and David, who work for on a programme Adaptation Scotland through the charity Sniffer, as well as Martin Massey, who is the Climate Change Special Interest Group IRM chair. So not to prompt anyone, but climate change is the theme of today. And I think that's really important in terms of, you know, we all kind of, it's been a tough year, 2020, 2021, in terms of risk managers trying to concentrate on matters that are not, you know, COVID-19 and the pandemic. And now that we're starting to see some changes in businesses and organisations, we can now start to look at other types of topic areas that are really quite, they are important in the organisational world and our personal environment. And I think, you know, whether you're watching Netflix documentaries, David Attenborough's, you know, the area of climate change is very much at the centre of the world at the moment, from things like coral bleaching, trees, climate change, global warming, etc. So as risk managers, we felt it was really important as we start a lot of these discussions in the organisation, and we're one of the best places to start those conversations. Today, Ellie, David and Martin will provide us some insight from a climate change lens. So hopefully we have, you really enjoy the session today. We've got a lot of people on the call. So the agenda is as follows. At 9, we're running probably a little bit late, but Ellie and David will basically provide the first presentation for nearly an hour. And they will discuss, I'm not going to steal their thunder, but they'll just discuss things about how to help prepare for climate change and the tools, etc. And then we'll hand over to Martin Massey, who will discuss things about the climate change SIG and some hot topics that the SIG are looking at the moment. A close at 11. The run of play and the order, which I think has worked in the last sessions, is on your, as you've come in as an attendee, you will see on your kind of control panel an area that says chat. So if you have any questions as the guest speakers are going through their presentations, please put in the chat any questions. I will go through those. We will have questions at the end, but if there's anything really pertinent and would really benefit from when the speakers are at a particular point, I will kind of interject. It just stops the guest speakers maybe getting put off the flow of their presentation. So that's how we will do the questions today, if that's okay. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ellie, and we will see if I can do this. Just taking a little minute, sorry guys. Okay, Ellie, it should be over to you.
Okay, can everyone see my slides now?
Yep. Sure can.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ellie Murta. And as Donna said, myself and my colleague David Harkin are here today to give a presentation on climate change risk. So as way of introduction, and as Donna has already alluded to, I work on the Adaptation Scotland programme. So for those of you who don't yet know us, we are a Scottish government-funded programme that is delivered by the sustainability charity called Sniffer. And we provide support and resources to businesses, communities and public sector organisations to adapt to the impacts of our changing climate. So we were really delighted to be asked by the Institute of Risk Management to come and give a talk about what we do and what climate change risk is. So I just want to give a quick overview of how we're going to do this today. Firstly, David is going to start us off by providing an overview of climate change trends and projections and what that means for Scotland. I'll then walk us through some basics of climate change risk, definitions and concepts, and how we can assess it, and importantly, the benefits to businesses and public sector organisations for assessing and addressing climate risk. Lastly, I'll hand back over to David, who's here wearing two hats today, as he'll give us a presentation on a climate change risk assessment that's ongoing in practice with Historic Environment Scotland. So without further ado, I will hand over to David Harkin now.
Thanks, Ellie. I think that's me up and running now with my slides. So as Ellie explained, I am kind of here with two hats today. So day to day, I work with Historic Environment Scotland, where I'm the climate change scientist, and my role is really all about understanding climate risk impacts and then what climate change adaptation measures we need as an organisation to reduce our exposure to climate risk, etc. But I'm also working with Adaptation Scotland just now on a variety of different projects that are kind of, or mostly rooted in understanding climate science. So how Scotland's climate has changed already and how Scotland's climate might change in the future. And that actually forms the structure of this first part of my presentation today. So I'm going to start by quickly talking about Scotland's current climate. We'll then have a wee think about what Scotland's climate might look like in the future, and then to sort of segue nicely into the next part that Ellie will be talking about, we'll quickly discuss how these changes in the climate that we're experiencing in Scotland then manifest themselves into climate risks for organisations like Historic Environment Scotland, but like all the organisations that you represent as well, across all the from all the different people here that are on the call today. And then later on, I'll pop back up and I'm going to give you an introduction to our Climate Ready HES project, but more on that later. So when thinking about Scotland's climate, and I've actually said it a couple of times already, and I've only been speaking for like a minute, when thinking about today's topic on climate risk and then thinking about our climate more generally, it's really a tale of two climates. So we're thinking about risks that we experience in the current climate. So that image on the left-hand side there is a weather warning issued by the Met Office for snow. So there's current climate risk that we already deal with and that we more or less, maybe not always, but more or less already manage. We're also thinking about future climate risk, so how the climate changes and what those changes in the climate mean for our risk portfolios in that sense. I won't go into the detail of what that graph on the right shows, but that's a little snippet of the UK climate change projections, and I'll talk about them in a wee bit more detail in a few slides' time. This is almost like high school geography, but actually I find it's just really interesting to start back at the basics, strip right back to the basics, and think about why Scotland has the climate that it has, and how and what influences our day-to-day weather. And everyone on the topic of weather is like one of the most popular topics of conversation up and down the country, and you will have heard people say that Scotland can get 4 seasons in one day, and actually that's really true, and it's all down to the fact, it's all down to the fact of where we're positioned in the world. So we have weather systems that emerge from over the Atlantic from the southwest, and when they sweep in over the country, they tend to bring mild and wet air. But we're also really close to the continental shelf of Europe, and when weather systems come in from those directions, it brings different types of weather. And so we'll all be quite familiar with events like Beast from the East a few years ago, and that happened because of sort of really cold air filled with snow coming over from the east, coming over from the continent, the east, and hitting the UK. So there's all these different air masses that influence the day-to-day weather that we get. But we're pretty good at dealing with that. You know, your wardrobe is full of clothes based on the climate that we have, but the outfit that you pick on the day will be based on the weather that's forecast for that day. So we're pretty well equipped to the climate that we're in, but that climate is changing. In fact, that climate has already changed, and in recent decades, we've seen quite a sustained shift in many aspects of our climate. So for example, in Scotland, the 10 warmest years ever recorded in a series that goes back to the end of the 1800s, the 10 warmest years have all occurred now since 1997. The most recent decade was around about 0.7 degrees warmer than a point earlier, or a baseline period earlier in the 20th century. There's been an increase in rainfall across all parts of Scotland, but there's been a particularly large increase in the amount of rain that falls on the very wettest days. So our wettest days are getting wetter, and the same can be said for temperature. Actually, our hottest days are getting hotter as well. And changes in the climate then go on to impact other things like sea level rise, for example. So there's been a sustained increase in sea level rises as well, from way back in the early 20th century, but still happening today and actually speeding up. This is the climate stripes graph, and I think it's just a really impactful and visual way of showing you what the science tells us in terms of a warming trend for Scotland. Now, each of the stripes on the graph in front of you represents a single year. So on the left-hand side, we're starting in 1884. On the right-hand side, we're way up to 2018, so it's just a couple of years out of date, this particular graphic, but the message is still the same. Now, each stripe is coloured based on what the average temperature was that year in relation to the 20th century average. So blue colours indicate years that were cooler than average. Red and warmer colours indicate years that were warmer than average. And what the pattern is, and it's really, really clear, is that in the past 20 or 30 years or so, more often than not, we are experiencing warmer than normal years. So the climate is changing. Now, there are natural cycles in the climate that mean there's been periods in the past when it's been warmer, periods in the past when it's been cooler, and the natural cycles do have an influence on the climate. However, what the climate science tells us is that the rate of change we're experiencing now can't be explained through natural cycles. It can only be explained through the increased levels of greenhouse gas emissions that humans are putting into the atmosphere. So the climate stripes that you see in front of you, just in summary, I think they're just a really clear visual way of demonstrating that Scotland is getting warmer. So we know Scotland's getting warmer. We then need to think about what the future holds for Scotland. So we're very, very lucky in Scotland and in the UK more generally to have what we call the UK Climate Change Projections, UK CP18, because they came out in 2018. They're produced by the Met Office in collaboration with a whole host of partners. They provide the very best information that we have about the potential future for Scotland's climate. Now, because predicting the future is really, really difficult and full of uncertainty, the projections are produced under a series of what we call representative concentration pathways. Bit of a mouthful, we call them RCPs for short. Now, there's 4 different RCPs, and each RCP gives us information on a plausible future climate for Scotland. And there's 4 different ones, like I say. So there's what we call RCP 2.6. That's a low emissions pathway. And in that world, in that world, the low emissions world, that's a world where we get to grips with our greenhouse gas emissions and we start to drastically reduce them and almost take them out of the atmosphere. And in doing so, we're able to stabilise the climate. So that's the world that we want to live in. At the other end of the scale is what we call RCP 8.5. That's a high emissions world, and that's a plausible, not the worst case scenario, but a bad case scenario for the future climate. In fact, a very bad case scenario. And that's where there's significant new investment in coal-fired power, greenhouse gas emissions continue to go up and up and up. And in that world, what we see is essentially almost runaway climate change. And that's demonstrated just on that graph to the right, which is showing us how Scotland's winter mean temperature could change up until the year 2100. The red solid line and the red shaded area tracks that high emissions world, RCP 8.5. The blue area and the blue solid line tracks that low emissions world. And what you can see is that post 2050, the climate has stabilised, but with a bit of a wobble. There's year-on-year variation in the climate, as we know. But that's the world we want to live in. We don't want to live where it shoots right up, sort of reaching the sort of 4, 5, 6 degree level of warming. Now, the science is complex. It's full of uncertainty because, like I mentioned, predicting the future is really, really difficult. But the climate science models are really, really good and really, really slick. And the brain power that goes into producing these models is just unimaginable. But you can break down the climate projections into some key headline messages for Scotland. So what we are pretty certain of is that Scotland will experience hotter and drier summers in the future with greater weather extremes. We are also pretty certain that Scotland's winters will get warmer and wetter with more intense rainfall events. So if you imagine the sort of really torrential bursts of rainfall where you get sort of flash flooding and issues like that, that the warmer world kind of promotes that type of rainfall over the type of rainfall that we already experience, because Scotland's pretty wet as is. I don't want to go into too much detail here, and this is a lot to take in, but I just wanted to quickly talk about the 2 scenarios just in a wee bit more detail, and I'll talk you through this. So on the left hand side, we're looking at change in summer temperature, and let's just focus on that one for now. The table at the top gives you 2 different time frames. So you've got change by the 2050s, change by the 2080s, and I just wanted to show you some actual figures of change so that you get a sense for how Scotland's climate might warm. So our summers by the 2050s in a low emissions world could be somewhere around about 1.2 degrees warmer than they are now. In a high emissions world, they could be somewhere around about 1.5 degrees warmer than they are now. Contrast that with the 2080s, so much further on into the century. By that point, under a high emission scenario, our summers could be around about 3 degrees warmer than they are now. Now, all this sounds lovely because who doesn't want a nicer, hotter, drier summer? But that cascades down into a series of impacts that will affect us, affect our organisations, etc. And I'm going to skip on to the next slide just to keep us moving. Yeah, I can skip that one just to keep us moving, but I'll break down the impacts for you in just a wee second. I just wanted to quickly touch on sea level rise as well. So here's an example for Edinburgh. So the low emission scenario, which is the blue box. So in a low emission scenario, by the year 2100, sea level could be up to 49 centimetres higher than they are now for Edinburgh. In that high emissions world, they could be up to 90 centimetres higher than they are now for Edinburgh. So again, just to sort of contrast that low emissions world and that high emissions world. So really the incentive for us as a society is clear. We need to drive down emissions, because if we drive down emissions, then we get to live in that low emissions world, which still has change in the climate, but it's not as severe as that high emissions world where we do not get a handle on our greenhouse gas emissions. This slide here, just a couple more to go. So I talked a wee bit about how the climate projections, even across all of the different scenarios that climate scientists produce, there's some key trends that we can take out from those scenarios. So we know that Scotland has a variable climate already. That's going to continue to be the case. And in fact, it's very likely that we'll experience more weather extremes than we do just now. We know that average temperatures will increase across all seasons. We know a typical summer will be warmer and drier. We know a typical winter will be milder and wetter. We know that intense heavy rainfall events will increase in frequency and intensity. We know that sea levels will rise, and we know that we'll experience less frost and snow. Now, this diagram here starts to link up the changes in the climate with the risks that we then have to consider for our respective organisations. So in the centre of the diagram, you've got greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions increase in levels in the atmosphere. When that happens, it causes changes to the climate system, which you see in that second circle. So more extreme weather, warmer summers, rising sea levels, etc. So greenhouse gas emissions cause that change to the climate system. A change to the climate system then impacts society. So rising sea levels affect coastal communities. Warmer summers could increase the chance of wildfire, for example, or the spread of pests and other invasive species that affect the agricultural sector, or we could have risk to water supplies, heat stress, etc. So it's not like it's not the best list that you want to read through, but we have to be aware that these impacts are happening. And then I'll just quickly shout out to a Adaptation Scotland publication, the 15 key consequences of climate change, which we'll send a link to afterwards. And it breaks down the key risks for Scotland. So things like security of our food supply, the performance of the buildings that we live and work in, occurrence of pest and disease, impacts to infrastructure. So I think that's me for now. I've gone a couple of minutes over. Apologies, Ellie, but I will pass back to you, and I'll also apologise for that rapid run through of climate change projection 101. There's a lot more to it than that, but only so much you can cover in 10 minutes.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, David. So I'll just bring my slides up. Is that okay now? Yep, okay. If I don't hear anything else, I'll continue.
Yeah, we can see your slides.
Fab, thanks very much for that. Thank you very much, David, for providing that really in-depth explanation of climate change science, trends, projections, and starting to allude to some of those consequences that we might see here in Scotland. So now, armed with that information, we're able to start to unpack and explore the concept of climate risk. Now, I appreciate almost all of you here today are risk managers and work very closely with this idea of risk. But we also know that you might come from a number of different sectors and backgrounds, and the way you see risk might be different. So that's why I just wanted to introduce you to how we define risk in the climate community. And the definition presented here on this slide is that proposed by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which, as the name suggests, is an intergovernmental body. And what it does is bring together eminent scientists and policymakers to give the world the most up-to-date scientific facts and reports on climate change. And this is their most recent thinking on risk. So as you can see in the top grey box here, how they define risk generally is the potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological systems. And importantly, I just want to highlight the second bit of the definition, in that they recognise the diversity of values and objectives associated with such systems. So there's multiple interpretations of that risk. And that's something we're going to touch upon a wee bit more later on in today's presentation. And with that interpretation of risk in mind, how that relates to climate change is unsurprisingly the risks that arise from our changing climate, as well as our human responses to climate change. And relevant adverse consequences range from those on our livelihoods, our jobs, our homes, our economy, as well as social and cultural assets, which relate to some of the climate change consequences that David highlighted in his last slide there. But risk as well results from the dynamic interactions. Apologies, I've just lost my slides. Yeah, from the dynamic interactions between a few different concepts. And I just want to introduce you to some of these now. Is that risk results from these interactions between hazards with exposure and vulnerability of the affected area, be that a human or environmental system. And I realise that sounds quite complex, it sounds quite tricky. So I'm just going to unpack some of those key terms before providing an example of what that actually means in practice. So firstly, we have the idea of a hazard. This simply relates to the physical event that might happen that could potentially cause adverse harm to livelihoods, our health, our well-being, our infrastructure, and our economy. but that depends on what is exposed. So our second concept is exposure, and that simply means what is in the path that could be affected by that hazard. And again, the IPCC have a very broad definition of it, and they call it the presence of people, livelihoods, species, or ecosystems, infrastructure, economic, social, or cultural assets in places and settings that could be adversely affected. So a whole host of things that could be impacted by the hazard. However, the extent to which they are impacted is influenced by what we call vulnerability. And vulnerability is simply the predisposition to be affected by those climate impacts. And that's made up of a few different concepts. The first is sensitivity. So how sensitive is the place, the system, the people? And that could be influenced by a whole range of factors. If we take human populations, some indicators of sensitivity include age. How elderly is the population? How young is the population? Which could affect their mobility. Is English potentially not a first language, and they might not be able to read or access early warning systems? Do you have a group population that already has health impacts or disabilities, which might mean they're less readily able to respond in emergencies? And that can also be influenced by what we call adaptive capacity, which, as the name suggests, is your capacity to adapt or cope. And that can also be further broken down into our ability to prepare, react, and recover. And taken all together, these concepts influence how climate impacts will play out and what risks may occur. So, as I said, I'm going to talk through what that actually means in practice. And I'll take one that's quite common, obviously, to Scotland, is increasing precipitation that might lead to a pluvial flood, so a flood that's caused by rain. But what's exposed will depend on a number of factors, namely topography and geography. So if you've got low-lying land, that's potentially heightened exposure. And this is just an example of some of the SIG flood maps that are available in Scotland to show exactly that. But then you also have to think about how sensitive your population is. You might have a high elderly population, but that might be offset, apologies, by adaptive capacity. Oh, I just can't see my slide there, but hopefully the image is behind. The adaptive capacity of having flood warning alerts. And in Scotland, we're quite privileged that we have SIG's floodline warnings, which alert people to imminent threats. So that's just a quick whistle-stop tour of how this concept of risk can be unpacked, and also just to really highlight that there's a number of different factors which influence how climate risks occur. And just to highlight, when I'm speaking about risk here, I'm mostly referring to what we call physical risk. So the changes in both weather and climate can cause impacts. And then these can be both acute, so extreme weather events, such as those that David alluded to. So we're talking, very hot, lethal heat waves, extreme floods, high intensity storms, cyclones, etc. But we can also have what we call chronic stresses. So these are much longer term gradual changes. So things like increasing temperature, sea level rise, or ocean acidification. And this is slightly different to another type of risk, which is sometimes spoken about in climate change, which is transition risk. And this refers to the risks that arise from our transition to a low carbon economy and society. And whilst these two are often treated separately, they're inevitably intertwined. Because without adapting and transitioning to a low carbon economy, we will have increasing physical impacts. So these two do need to be addressed together. And I know David and Martin will be discussing this a wee bit more in their presentations. But just to flag for the rest of my slides, I will be focusing more predominantly on the physical risks. So when we know we have risks, what do we do to identify them? Well, as you all know as risk managers, risk assessment is a crucial part of this. And by that, I just mean the qualitative and/or quantitative estimation of those risks. And from a climate change perspective, a climate change risk assessment can be undertaken across a number of different scales and scopes. So for example, you can have one at the national level, and indeed we in the UK, again, are quite lucky that we have this. We have a UK climate risk assessment, the most recent of which was just launched last Wednesday, so you might have seen it on the news. It got a huge amount of publicity and has taken about 3 years of scientific research and evidence preparation. But you can also have them at a more local level, potentially at a city or city region. And again, an example I wanted to highlight here is that of Climate Ready Clyde, which is a climate adaptation partnership in the Glasgow city region. And again, they spent a number of years doing a very robust evidence of what climate change risk and opportunities there are for the Glasgow city region. And that's open access and available online. And again, we'll be sure to share the links after this. But you might also want to just focus on what are the risks of a really specific hazard. So for example, a recent report by Nature Scott just looked at what does drought mean for the natural environment in Scotland. Or indeed, you might be looking at it at the project or asset level or at the organisational level. And that's what Adaptation Scotland has been looking at. So we have guidance that we've prepared to support climate change risk assessments at both the strategic and project level. And both these resources are free and open access and available on our website. And that's where you can access a lot more of the detail and further resources. But what I'm going to do today is just highlight some of the key common steps that are important when undertaking a climate change risk assessment. So the first of which I wanted to flag was the importance of scoping the risk assessment. So as was highlighted on the previous slide, there's a whole host of different approaches that you can do to climate change risk assessment, and the one in which you choose depends on why you're undertaking the risk assessment. And some important things to ask yourselves before deciding on that methodology include the aims and objectives. You know, is the risk assessment being undertaken to identify climate risk the whole organisation, or just a few different key aspects or services or assets? Also, things to think about is, do you have the resources in-house and knowledge? Can this be done internally, or will you need to go out to hire a consultant or some expert advice? And then importantly, that relates to the scope. How wide-reaching is this risk assessment? Who would you like to target, both in terms of evidence, but also the output audience? And what's your time frame? And again, increasingly, we're seeing organisations wanting to do risk assessments to align with their low carbon targets. So if that's to be net zero by 2045, what adaptation actions do they need to be taking alongside that? So just some considerations to think about before you get stuck into a climate change risk assessment. And then once you get cracking, one of the first key steps is, as I'm sure with all other risk assessments, is to start to gather some evidence. And by this, we mean evidence of both historical and current climate change trends and impacts. And there's a few different ways you can do that. First off, by identifying existing data and resources that are out there. Again, in Scotland, we are quite lucky that we have quite a wide-reaching and robust landscape of climate data and evidence, ranging from SEPA, so the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency's National Flood Risk Assessment and their flood risk maps. As David mentioned, we have the UK climate projections. In Scotland, we also have a project that's called the Dynamic Coast, which looks at coastal erosion and sea level rise across the country. And we also have a tool that's called Climate Just, which explores the index of social multiple deprivation alongside some climate variables to start to identify which areas and populations are most vulnerable to climate change. Next up, you should start to consider some previous extreme weather events, and that can be done by looking at media reports, but also looking in-house. Do you have insurance claims for specific events, or health and safety logs that you can refer to start to build that quantitative evidence base? But you can also start to speak to others in your organisation and to ask how they've been affected, how that has impacted on the organisation's activities and priorities. And that can be done through interviews, of which we have a template for, or indeed a workshop that brings everyone together to think about this. Because it's that stakeholder engagement which is really, really key. And we say this because we strongly feel that risk assessments are an opportunity not only to identify risks, but also build a shared understanding of what those risks are and what climate change may mean for your organisation or your business, so that you can help build the case for climate action. And again, there's a few different steps that we'd recommend here. First off, just understanding who you need to speak to through stakeholder mapping, to understand who has evidence that might help inform the risk assessment. And I just want to again highlight here that by evidence, obviously it's great to have some quantitative figures and monetary costs, but that's not all. We can really benefit from qualitative evidence as well. And by that, I mean some lived experience of risk. all of us here today have experienced an adverse weather event in our life, especially in Scotland, and having that history and that story is integral to climate change risk assessment processes. And again, this relates to that second section of the risk definition that I alluded to at the very start of my section of the presentation, which says that there's a diversity of values and objectives associated with risk, and different individuals will evaluate risks differently, and that is often because risks play out differently across different communities and geographies for a multitude of factors ranging from our jobs and our professions, our gender, our ethnicity, our religion, all will influence how climate impacts will affect us. So it's really important to consider this within your risk assessment process. And this can be done through participatory processes such as citizen science, workshops and focus groups to help you explore how weather and climate related risks have affected different groups differently. And again, we have a number of resources on our website and are just starting about to do this with a project in the Outer Hebrides and the Community Planning Partnership. So watch this space for further information on that in due course. So the next key step, once you have scoped your risk assessment, you have gathered some evidence, you've spoken with and engaged your stakeholders, through that process you can start to identify some emerging climate risks and opportunities. And again, I imagine this is very similar to your risk assessment approach as risk managers, is the need to draft descriptions of those risks and opportunities using cause and effect. So in our circumstances, we refer to the hazard and the impact. So for example, a risk of heat waves might lead to increased morbidity and mortality. Or you might have reduced financial costs and fuel poverty from reduced winter heating demand as a result of warming winters. Or in terms of businesses, you might have an impact on supply chains as a result of an extreme severe weather event. But once those risk descriptions have been drafted, again, we then encourage you to go and seek feedback from stakeholders to sense check them. Does this resonate with their experience? Does this language make sense to them? Because we're really keen for risk assessments to be actually used in practice, and that's why they should be tailored to the audiences accordingly. Now, once you have those risk and opportunities descriptions, that can be put into a risk register. Now, again, I imagine all of you have your own risk assessment approaches and registers, and climate change risk can be incorporated within those. But for those of you who would like some help and support, we actually have a template available on our website for a climate change risk assessment approach. And it takes a very standard approach to climate change risk, where it prompts you to write down the risk opportunity description, then probes you a wee bit more to map out all the potential consequences. So maybe there's some indirect impacts of that risk that you've identified. And then to assign a likelihood score and an impact score based on the current inherent risk. And through that, identify that first risk rating. Then you start to think about, well, what's in place to manage that risk currently or that's planned to come in the near future? And write that down in the mitigants and controls section. Then reflecting upon what the risk is, what you've got to manage it, how does that change the likelihood and impact rating? To provide you with a second residual risk scoring. And then our final column there is the treatments are proposed. So again, if you're doing this in a group or workshop setting, someone might have ideas for, okay, we're doing this already to manage the risk, but what we really need to do is this. And you can start to capture that in this risk assessment template. Now, as I said in the risk description section, it's really important to map out the cause and effect of the hazard and the impact. And as you'll have seen from that risk slide, there's lots of different things that influence climate risk. So it's important to start to think about those things. And we have a tool which we call impact chains to just help you map these things out. And I know it looks a wee bit complicated on this slide, but it's simply just a mapping tool to help you understand the system that you're studying. So this is a real life example that was created by stakeholders in Glasgow to look at the effect of sea level rise on domestic properties. And what they've just done is they've taken the hazard and thought, okay, what are all the things that affect sensitivity of the area and the population to that? What do we have already in terms of adaptive capacity to cope with that risk? And are there a number of different impacts that result or relate to that risk? And we have a template available online to do this, but even if you don't need that much fancy resources, you can simply do this with post-it notes, either in person or using a digital tool such as Miro, just to help you understand what is the root influences of that risk. So you can start to think about how you might address those as well. But whilst impact chains help you unpack one risk, it's also important to start to think about the interdependencies and interactions between risks. And there's some really exciting emerging research that's come out from the Committee on Climate Change that looks at what we call systems mapping for risks. And the example here, I just want to highlight this picture with all the circles. This looks at the effects of extreme temperature and infrastructure. So we look at the top orange circle, it says extreme summer temperatures. And if we work our way from left to right, you can see that might influence heat waves or very hot days, which could impact IT and comms infrastructure. It could increase power and water demand, which might lead to power water supply interrupted, IT comms disrupted, and then you see those red arrows on the right here show the links to all the other risks they've identified. So you can see lost productivity, so an economic risk, buildings and trains overheated, an infrastructure risk. So it's just to start to think about all the different relationships between these risks. And again, this is quite a complex approach. It's used modelling and quantitative figures sit behind it. However, if you don't have that sort of resource in place, simply just mapping it out on pen and paper with some post-its just to start to get you to think about those relationships is incredibly useful. But once you've got that understanding, you've put it in your risk register, the next really crucial step and an element that I think differentiates climate change risk assessments from potentially other sectors or areas is our look to the future. Because as David alluded to, it's a tale of two climates, both historical and future. So within our risk register template, we have a section which is all about future climate change risk. So it gets you to think about the risks we've identified and then see how those might play out into the future. In our example here, we've used the 2050s, but that time frame should be changed to suit whatever your decision-making horizon is within your organization. Is that for 2030? Is it for 2080? And then consider, as we've done previously, the inherent risk, what mitigants and controls you have in place, and what the residual risk is. And there's a whole host of resources out there to inform your thinking about the future. As David alluded to, we have the UK Climate Projections Summary for Scotland that's available on our website, which shows you those high-level trends and figures. But we also recently have a UK Socioeconomic Scenarios Pathways, which was just recently released last month, and further training will be offered over this summer to start to think about not only how climate change will affect these risks, but also our wider social and economic changes. Now, once you've identified these risks, it's obviously important to score them. And there's a few different ways you can approach this. First is using the traditional risk scoring approach, which I'm sure many of you use, a 5x5 table. However, we're increasingly seeing an alternative approach, which can be either used instead of or in combination with this risk scoring method, which is that of urgency scoring. And this was proposed by the Committee on Climate Change to inform that UK climate change risk assessment that I mentioned. And it's simply a way to think of which risks you need to address first. And as you can see, it just uses a decision tree structure to prompt you to consider a few different questions in relation to the risk. First off, what's the current level of the risk? If it's low, then it's less urgent. If it's high, unsurprisingly, it's more urgent. Is the risk being managed? Do you have adaptation actions in place already? Then it's less urgent. If there's this huge shortfall, you're not doing anything, that's obviously going to increase its urgency. And then that third question is really speaking about benefits. When do you need to take these actions? And if it's urgent, that can be further differentiated into further investigation. So we know there's a risk, we don't know everything about it, we need to do some more research. That falls into that category. Or we know there's a risk, we've got heaps of data on it, but we've got nothing to do to mitigate it, more action is needed. So just to highlight this current thinking on urgency scoring. And I wanted to touch upon that because we've been using this approach to inform the climate change risks for Scotland. So again, as I mentioned, we have a UK climate change risk assessment that was released last week. And as part of that, they've done risk assessments for each of the devolved administrations. So there is a summary report just for Scotland, and that's available online. And in that, they have described that there's 61 climate risks and opportunities that have been identified. But if you look through their urgency rating scores that they've applied, you can see only 7 have been identified as needed to sustain current action. So 6 out of 71 risks are currently being managed appropriately. All of the others require more action, whether that's further investigation or more action on the ground. And that emphasises that there's a shortfall between what is being done and what needs to be done to assess and address climate risk. And that leads to what we call an adaptation gap. And this obviously needs to be addressed, and we do this through what we call climate adaptation. So a climate change risk assessment can obviously help identify what risks you need to address and inform an adaptation response plan. So I wanted to really emphasise that adaptation is key, not just to mitigate those risks, but there's also massive benefits to adapt. And this is what we call a triple dividend. And this shows that there's a number of different benefits to taking adaptation. So the first dividend is avoided losses. So that's the ability of the investment to reduce future losses. So less economic damages when a climate impact occurs. The second is the positive economic benefits. So you might have enhanced productivity, you might have innovation and new jobs creation through what we call an adaptation economy. And the third, which I think is the most important, are the social and environmental benefits that we have from adapting. So again, to put this into practice, if we take an example, if we're to implement a nature-based solution for flooding, you obviously have the avoided losses of minimized flooding, but you also have potentially created an amenity where people can come, enjoy and play, and that has health and well-being benefits. So there's a whole host of co-benefits on adaptation that can obviously enhance the economy, the place, and also your reputation. So the example I wanted to highlight here is again from Glasgow City region, in that, as I mentioned, they spent years doing a climate change risk assessment across the city region, a whole number of stakeholders. And that helped inform a 2-year process to draft a adaptation strategy and action plan. And that's actually going to be launched next Tuesday, and the event is open to all. So if you are interested, please do come along. The event is on Eventbrite and you can register. And it also will be featured by The Guardian and the BBC. So please do keep a lookout on Tuesday. So you've been forewarned that it's coming. But if I haven't convinced you that it's important to assess and address your climate change risks because of the benefits of doing it, I'd also like to highlight that it's a legal requirement. So if you are a public body in Scotland, you are legally required to report on how you've assessed current and future climate-related risks and what arrangements you have in place to manage those risks. And that's part of the Climate Change Scotland 2009 Act, which put in place what we call public body climate change reporting duties. And every public body has to report every year, so it's on an annual basis, and all those reports are publicly available. So you can access those on what we call the Sustainable Scotland network website. But if you're not a public body, don't think you're off the hook, because increasingly stakeholders are going to be asking for risk assessments to consider climate change as well. So we've recently seen the G7 making this call, but also in the UK, our task force has recently released a roadmap towards mandatory climate-related disclosures for a whole host of business sectors, ranging from UK-housed businesses, insurance, and pension providers. And that's over the next 3 to 5 years. And it outlines what exactly you'll need to disclose in terms of climate-related risks. And again, there's a whole host of further guidance and resources on this that we can provide following today's webinar. And again, I believe that Martin will touch upon this a wee bit more when he presents. Sorry. But as we sit here talking about climate change risks in our virtual workshop and webinar today, it's really hard not to think about the most imminent and pressing risk, which is that of the pandemic. And I just wanted to highlight that COVID-19 and climate change share many similarities. They're both wide-reaching, they both have quite severe consequences and impacts. They have disproportionately and unfairly affected the poor and those already vulnerable and disadvantaged. And they also have characters which have uncertainty related to them. But that's why it's increasingly important to learn from our experience of how we've addressed the risk of COVID-19 and the pandemic, particularly when we start to work towards a Green New Deal and a recovery. And that it is crucial that an assessment of climate change risk and inclusion of adaptation actions to measure those risks is included with any of our future plans. And that's where I think all of you here today have such an important role to play, because risk managers obviously assess risk within your business and organisation. So I would hope we have taken today's webinar that climate change risk definitely cannot be ignored, and indeed identifying and addressing it has massive benefits to yourselves. So as I've said, there's benefits of assessing climate risk and taking adaptation action early, because the costs of adapting now pale in comparison to the costs of unfettered climate change risk. And because of that, we have a multitude of resources and guidance that are available to support you in addressing those risks. So please feel free to go to our website to download any of those, but also get in touch if you've got a question, and we're here to help. So please drop us a line, and we'd be happy to help. And one way in which we do help is providing case studies of real life adaptation in practice. So I'm really delighted to be now handing over to my colleague David again, who will give a brief presentation on how Historic Environment Scotland has undertaken a climate change risk assessment. So I'll stop sharing now and hand over to you, David.
Thanks, Ellie.
Hi, David.
Yeah, hi, Donna. You're going to tell me about time, aren't you?
Yes. So just if you could maybe keep it short if you can, just so that we don't go over.
I can. I'll pick a few key slides, highlight slides.
Donna,
oh.
could you change it to David, because I unfortunately can't change my screen to David.
Sure can.
Okay, I think that's me up and running.
Yes.
So yeah, I'll just spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes just telling you really quickly about what our Climate Ready HES project is. So Ellie's given you a really insightful journey through climate risk and how to assess climate risk, and then what that might mean for an organisation as it gets a handle on the climate risks that it's exposed to. We used loads of the tools that Ellie spoke about during her presentation, and essentially we put together a project called Climate Ready HES, where we wanted to conduct an organisational-wide assessment of climate risks and opportunities. We wanted to identify solutions to lower the risk and to take the opportunities presented to us. We wanted to mainstream climate action throughout the organisation. So in order to do that, we wanted to identify risk owners. So it's often been seen that climate risk was the responsibility of me as being someone in the climate change team, but actually a mature organisation should have responsibility for addressing climate risk mainstreamed throughout. And we wanted to use the results of the climate change risk assessment to inform a climate change adaptation strategy for the organisation. So here's the timeline for what we went through. Ellie touched on some of these steps as well. We put together a project team in step 1, and part of that mainstreaming process was to find the right people in the right places across all directorates in our organisation to take part in a project, the project. The project team then went out and gathered data and evidence, so they assessed what the responsibilities of their business area was, how the climate already impacts their ability to carry out those responsibilities and functions, how the future climate might change, the risk associated with delivering those responsibilities and different functions. And they also thought about solutions to address the risk, and also where the risk should be owned specifically within the organisation, which was great because you really need the insight of people from across the organisation in order to produce a really good detailed climate risk assessment. In step 3, the project team came back together. So by this point, they'd all produced climate risk registers. We'd done a sort of peer review exercise of the climate risk registers. We looked to see where there was commonalities between them, where there was duplicates, where there was themes emerging. We put them all together. We ran through a prioritisation exercise with them, similar to the one that Ellie showed you, the sort of step-by-step question that you ask rather than the quantitative assessment of urgency. In step 4, which is where we are just now, we're writing up the results. So I don't have the proper results to share yet, but what I can tell you is that it's been brilliant. We've come up with a list of 30 key climate risks that we believe are most pertinent to the organisation. So for example, one of our functions as an organisation is to run visitor-facing properties like Edinburgh Castle, for example. So the physical climate risk to somewhere like Edinburgh Castle is increased frequency of site closures due to bad weather, health and safety risks to visitors from more extreme weather events and natural hazard events, but also increased damage to the property itself and the infrastructure, the visitor infrastructure, from periods of bad weather. The transition risk for somewhere like Edinburgh Castle is the fact that we're really quite dependent on the international tourism sector to generate revenue. And if COVID has taught us anything, it's that that sector is highly vulnerable to big shocks. Like COVID, climate change is the next big shock coming for a sector like that. So that puts us in a place of risk. The other key transition risk would be stronger targets on public sector bodies like HES to reduce all scopes of emissions. So not just the emissions that we generate through our direct function, but emissions that we are partly responsible for through our wider activity, which actually includes emissions from visitors travelling overseas to come and visit our places. So there's a transition risk there that if we don't get a handle on that, then we don't meet our net zero obligations by 2045. I won't tell you the exact, well, I was going to go through some risk examples, but essentially we have 5 key areas of climate risk that we've identified. Risks to our people, risks to our operations, risks to the natural capital associated with the properties that we care for, risk to the physical assets that we have in our care, so not only the properties that we care for, but our IT and communications infrastructure, heating and cooling demands of buildings, etc. And transition risks. And when Ellie said sort of sitting down with post-its to map out risks is really valuable, I can't stress enough how valuable it is. So this is an example of a chain that we started to map out for our transition climate risks. So on the left-hand side, the driver is changes in policy and legislation. The risk or opportunity to us as an organisation could be enhanced reporting requirements, could be increased pricing of sectors that are heavily dependent on greenhouse, or that are high emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. The other risk could be misalignment of our own policy and strategy with that of the climate change targets and objectives, because they change quite rapidly. But there's opportunities for us to provide sector leadership on climate action. There's opportunities for us to improve our resource efficiency. But the impact if we don't address those risks or take the opportunity could be increased pressure on our staff, increased operating costs, reputational damage as well, but also missing the climate change targets that have been set for us. I don't want to, this is the final 2 slides so that I don't stress you out, Donna. You've seen a graph like this already earlier in the presentation. We're tracking 2 futures here in changing temperature for Scotland. So the high emission scenario, that's the runaway climate change that we do not want to experience. The blue line, that's the stable climate that we do want to live in. But if you focus on that grey shaded box in the middle, what you should see is that up until about the year 2050, those 2 scenarios actually track quite closely together. And that's because the change in our climate up until around about the 2050s is already locked into the system. So we know with with absolute certainty, that up until 2050 there will be a change in the climate, and we can model quite well what that change will be. Now, if you take that grey box, stretch it out, which I've done here, I've dashed lined the emissions targets for Scotland, and then underneath it, there's a timeline of decisions that we make as an organisation. And it was this slide, I think, that has revolutionised the climate ready HES process for us. Because as soon as you start to map out some of the decisions that we take as an organisation, or some of the plans and policies that influence how and what we do as an organisation, what you see is that 2045 is not far away. So, we're maybe only 3 corporate plans away from having to be a net zero climate ready organisation. If we're refurbishing an office that, say, has a 20-year lifespan, that takes you up to the front door of 2045. If we're installing a new gas boiler and you want that to last 15 years or 10, 15 years, that is taking you really close to the sort of 2040, 2045 targets. So this is a fundamental point in climate risk, and what has come through really strongly in the results from our climate ready HES process is that we have to start making decisions today that are fit for the future. We need to make sure that decisions that we are making now are not locking in additional climate risk to the organisation, which is why it's really, really important that organisations start undertaking proper climate risk assessments to make sure that they understand what risk they could inadvertently lock in, because when the Committee on Climate Change released their report, Climate Change Risk Assessment report for the UK last week, what they said was that there's been hundreds of thousands of new houses built in the past 5 years, the majority of which are not fit for the future changes in the climate, particularly in terms of temperature, and will be at risk from overheating. What the Committee on Climate Change have said is that it will be more expensive to retrofit those buildings so that they can deal with the climate than had they just put the measures in place at the time of building. So there's an example of locking in climate risk. So that's where I'll end it. I can't stress enough, the resources that Adaptation Scotland produce are incredible and super helpful, and I would seriously encourage you all to go out and use them and maybe try your own climate ready project as well. There's a strategy coming, I think. I'm writing it just now. I hope we get to launch it later in the year. And that's me.
Thank you, David. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to leave them to the end. If we don't get to questions, the people that do have questions in the question box, we can maybe pick that up afterwards, just so that the question is quite good and we can share that with the audience. So in the essence of time, I'm going to hand you over to Martin Massey, who will talk about the climate change SIG with the IRM. So Martin, you should have the screen. Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yes, sure can. You're fit to go.
Great. Okay. I'm obviously aware of time, so I'll try to just sort of give a high-level oversight of the work that we're doing. Obviously, very pleased to be here today. Obviously, collaborating through the IRM, and this is the way that we're trying to operate. You know, we have a separate climate change SIG, and we're looking to support other SIGs and RIGs across the IRM Institute. I've been involved in the IRM for about 25 years. I actually helped write the Horizon Scanning Guide a couple of years ago, which actually has been particularly helpful for the industry with the pandemic and now with climate change. My background, just briefly, I've been involved primarily in the insurance and risk industry for about 30 years, worked with some of the major leading global insurance companies and brokers, but primarily focusing on advising corporates. I have been a CRO in the insurance sector for about 5 years before starting my own business about a year ago, One Risk Consulting, where I'm focusing on advising primarily the financial services sector in climate change. And I'm currently an advisor to Milliman on their global climate change strategy, and also Agbesto, who are a digital platform to provide solutions around use of parametric insurance. So I'll be covering some of those points. So effectively, I'm wearing sort of two hats. One, obviously focus on the IRM, and the other one is actually trying to help organizations implement their climate change plans. So really the focus of today, I wanted to give an update really on the activities of the SIG. Clearly, we're looking to get more membership to the IRM and membership of the climate change SIG. I'll talk briefly around some of the key activities of the last 12 months. So the launch of our training course that we've spent about a year planning for in conjunction with Imperial College and Grantham Institute. Update on some of the other activities, our newsletter, webinar events, and development of our practitioner's guide. And I know sort of there are, I mean, in the last presentation, there's lots of good information there. I'll try and pick up on some of the themes there around sort of hot topics, hot issues that we're seeing in the industry or by practitioners, and some of the next steps that we're planning as a SIG. So in terms of our aims and objectives, I mean, we're trying to develop thought leadership. I mentioned, you know, develop the practitioner's guide. We're developing one for climate change, and we're just launching part A, such a big topic. We're actually splitting the guide into two phases. We are trying to evaluate latest tools and techniques for members, and obviously we'll cover some of those today. engage with with the IRM membership, the wider risk management community, organising events. We are undertaking our own research, engaging through, for example, surveys, looking at emerging risk themes, and generally developing strategic relationships and partnerships. You'll see in the presentation we are already working with academic institutions like Imperial, Grantham. I've just started a project now with ClimateWise, part of Cambridge University, which I'll talk on to as well. We're trying to, the IRM is also trying to support wider research to help in terms of climate change topics that we see of interest to our members. In terms of the committee, sort of membership committee, we have a committee of about 8 members. We meet monthly, so it's voluntary roles. We're doing this just to in a way sort of part-time to help support the IRM and also gain knowledge. And then we're trying to build memberships. We are growing the membership. I mean, these are just people. The membership here is not the IRM membership. It's about 9,000, but just a membership that are actually focusing or interested in climate change. So we welcome people to join, and you'll get, for example, the update on the newsletter, which I'll be talking about. So I wanted to give a brief update on the training course, which obviously is a big launch for the IRM. It takes quite a long time to put together a course, such a complex topic as climate change. So we felt it was good to actually collaborate with leading university, which is the Imperial College, where we built quite a good relationship, where they have a global centre of excellence of research and education on climate change. So we launched a course in April over 2 days, and you'll see there the trainers. I was actually one of the trainers as part of representing the IRM, along with Dr. Sarah Gordon, who's the lead trainer for the IRM. And then we had 3 professors from Imperial who were giving quite a lot of input into the latest science and also research projects that they're on. We've had very good feedback. Obviously, we're all sort of generally experts in this field to help help risk managers gain a better understanding of climate change and what it means to their organisations. The overall course aims were to focus and help risk managers learn more about climate change risks. To say the profile of attendees, primarily we've had a broad mix of risk managers, both from public, private sector, different industry sectors, different levels. We even had CROs attending. So we were trying to sort of balance the content. The structure is over 2 days. We've had interactive sessions. We're actually extending now from 3 hours to 4 hours each day, and we're planning future sessions in September and December. We're trying to make it interactive. We try to include case studies. So we, for example, have case studies around climate risk disclosures, TCFD guidance, physical climate risk, impacts on mortgage lending, which is a important topic at the moment for the regulators, focusing in on the impact of flooding in the UK across the insurance sector and banking sector. Climate surveillance tools, use of satellite-based tracking of emissions, and net zero versus carbon neutrality and asset management. So we are, obviously it's a big subject where we're trying to touch on lots of different aspects of climate change within the course. We've developed a framework which is on the right-hand side, which is developed by the SIG committee. So we're trying to help use the training course and blend it with the work that we're doing, the research we're doing within the SIG, and focus on the first day around just understanding climate change, very much linked to the presentation we just heard previously today. And then secondly, I think really then it's the practical applications, tools and techniques to help risk management implement into their risk management frameworks. So Professor Martin Siebert is actually co-director of Grantham Institute, and he provides a very good detailed presentation on the latest science. Interestingly, we just heard about heat waves, and just just some practical examples of some of the work that I'm involved with or have been involved with in looking at parametric insurance for the agricultural sector, impact of heat waves. With Milliman, we are looking at the impact on healthcare system, and looking at the impact on insurance companies around mortality risk, etc., and obviously the impacts across are impacting a number of other sectors. It is good to look at historical events. I think, as we all know, historical events do shape or have shaped the evolution of enterprise risk management over the last 20, 30 years, 40 years. Regulators tend to pick up on what events have been happening. Here's just a couple of examples linked to, a couple of them are linked to heat, actually, with the rail infrastructure being impacted. Had discussion of Network Rail. It's an ongoing problem. Obviously, certain temperature, certain thresholds start to have then business interruption impacts, which actually have a wider impact on society. Corporate failures, that's quite a new phenomenon now. We saw that with the wildfires in California, electricity company being sued effectively for inaction, and generally there's a lot more litigation going on now, and that's something that companies are really starting to focus on, and from a legal perspective, as was mentioned earlier, about making sure that you comply with the latest regulations, do what you can to prevent events happening. And obviously natural catastrophes in general, we're seeing more and more increased frequency and severity, major events, particularly storms and flooding. As part of the course, we'll interject some case studies. I won't delve into much detail, but clearly there are lots of, talked about risk assessment tools. Here on the right hand side, this is use of econometric modeling to project temperature. This is an output for 80 years of temperature, and actually you'll see there the decreased line is effectively the impacts of climate change. But what it's trying to do here, I think there's an over focus on climate change itself, but actually what we're talking about from a risk perspective is volatility, but the increase in volatility, and actually making and projecting that going into the future, which I think was well articulated in the last presentation. And really what the focus here is, for example, this is a major utility company, so their focus, for example, was looking at mild winter. So really trying to understand the specific issue or risk that you need to model for your organization, and in this case, looking at developing a hedging strategy that might be a way of reducing volatility of future events impacted directly on your revenues or your capital. So moving on to the newsletter, just a quick update. So we felt as a committee there's such a lot of information out there in public domain, and tried to raise awareness. We've centralized our knowledge and thinking by developing a bi-monthly or every 2 to 3 months issue a newsletter, which we send out to the members, primarily focusing on legal regulatory guidance and updates. And because we're trying to keep it up to date with the latest thinking is quite difficult. Some of the focus areas are that we try to provide an update on our own activities, so it gives the members an update on what we're doing, and then focus on putting in articles, publications. Some of those we obviously write as part of it. Helps us to think about publishing articles ourselves around risk management, updates on science, updates on regulatory change, and then updates on upcoming conferences. So we are looking to, for continued enhancements, so engage and collaborate with other SIG committees, welcome more collaboration and input from members. And if people are interested in supporting the SIG, then please reach out. Just as a snapshot, maybe hot topics. Clearly, a lot of focus, and we had the G7 conference only a week ago. Governments, regulators really looking at the how to reach carbon net zero targets. Obviously, organisations are following that up. There's lots of really insightful articles, updates. For example, Mark Carney's recent article about public finance. Obviously, pledges now with the new Biden administration. We're seeing lots of more activity around targets being set by governments. Obviously, that's then filtering down, as we saw in the last presentation. And then, practical examples of steps of what can we do to actually make a difference. So obviously, heat loss, energy loss is a big issue. So government's now looking at, for example, phasing out new boilers with heat pumps, etc. So what is it that we can do? So we're trying to capture those practical updates, and what's coming down the line in terms of new regulations as well that the industry needs to think about. One of the most exciting developments from a personal point of view is that we've been engaging with ClimateWise as part of the Cambridge University's Institute for Sustainability Finance, and they are, and there's even news today, there was actually an update this morning. Prince Charles is sponsoring a project with Lloyd's of London to look at how the insurance industry can play a bigger role, and we're actively engaged with supporting ClimateWise in looking at net zero underwriting. It's a pilot study that we're working on at the moment, and the idea is the objectives are to provide practical approaches to net zero underwriting, and from the insurance industry itself, as you can imagine, can play a very pivotal role here. The idea is to showcase the role of the insurance sector, to look at primarily transition risk, how it can actually support the wider economy, complement other net zero activities. There are external parties involved, including United Nations and COP26. So it's quite an exciting initiative to be involved with. And effectively, we've developed a risk assessment tool in conjunction with Milliman. We've researched all the underlying drivers and impacts. But the really, I think, key focus at the moment, which I don't think there's been enough focus on it by a lot of industries, is really sort of practical, pragmatic approaches to how can we change business processes and practices. So, for example, incentivization of premiums, how to support, improve risk management, how does that impact on how you choose your clients and how you price those in, so pricing decisions, new product development, and generally around your underwriting strategy and risk appetite, risk selection, how to make sure that you've got enough reinsurance protection as an industry. And there's a lot of focus now on the use of flood re, for example. They're being phased out. So what are the alternatives to provide flood protection for very, very vulnerable properties? It's a big societal problem at the moment. Just a quick output here as part of the process. So we recognize that companies need to really drill in to think about what's the impact of frequency and severity of, across claims, premiums. And really the transition risk is an area where there's a lot of focus now, looking at changes in consumer demand, technology shifts to greener assets, and new climate-ready insurance products. I was fortunate to be involved last year with Icebreaker One, where we got funding to look at work with the insurance industry to develop new innovative insurance solutions, and that's a key area of focus now with the shifts. What can the insurance industry do? And again, NewsNasa, I saw in the last presentation, some of the publications are very good publications out there being undertaken, for example, by the Geneva Association, looking at the impacts of litigation across the world. Obviously, lots of firms are doing research around specific hot topics like sustainability in the supply chain. That's a very important issue now, particularly around looking at scope 1, 2, 3. Organizations think about how they can adapt their supply chains, how they onboard their suppliers to reduce emissions, etc., to comply with regulatory requirements. So in terms of events, I'm aware of, just think about time here. How much time have we got? Just checking.
We have another kind of 5-10 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah. So our SIG event, so we're trying to hold 2 or 3 events a year. We had a couple of really good events last year involving the Bank of England. We had 120 attendees before COVID happened. Obviously now we're doing everything online. And we have a future event coming up in July, which is around practical approaches to integrate climate change into your risk management frameworks. We've got some really good speakers from a number of leading insurance companies, a couple of chief risk officers, really going to give us some practical insights of how they're actually implementing climate change into their frameworks. I won't dwell on this too much, but what I would say is that there's a lot of focus now on focusing on the insurance sector, but the insurance sector actually to support the wider industries around use of, for example, parametric solutions. I was fortunate to go out on a trade mission to Colombia last year, which was very generic around, well, one of the biggest impacts that climate change is happening is on the agricultural sector. Lots of natural perils that we're seeing, and we touched on in the last presentation, drought, excess rain, heat waves, etc. But there are solutions out there. There are very good now use of developing solutions around heat wave policies to support, I would say, more bespoke solutions for individual clients. We're talking to mutual insurance companies in the UK to develop crop insurance solutions for farmers, and that's a global issue now that's being looked at. Traditional insurance isn't working particularly well, so what are the new solutions? So moving on to the practitioner's guide. So we, as a SIG, we thought it'd be good to actually support the industry by developing a practitioner's guide. We've actually split it into two parts, so part A, part B. I'll just sort of give you a quick update on what we've got in part A. The backdrop of this was really regulatory expectations. Obviously, people are aware of lots of, if you like, filtering down from government into policies. Probably one of the most important regulators, the PRA, in terms of giving guidance. SS319 gives really good guidance around governance, risk management, scenario analysis and disclosures. I won't go into the detail. Most people are obviously probably aware, but it's interesting to look at different regulations across different parts of the world. In Singapore, quite advanced regulations, Australia, etc. So it's very good to actually understand what the regulators expect, and not, I know this is financial services focused, but actually it's very good guidance for all organizations. In terms of the risk landscape, there are a lot of discussions around taxonomy, so fiscal transition liability. Developing a risk radar is a very important aspect of your risk identification before you do the assessment, to really think through mapping out your risks into risk radar, and that's a lot of organizations are doing that now. And it's it's looking at the strategic risks, the operational risks, the financial risk, and hazard risks, however you define and build that into your framework. Probably one of the most important aspects of climate change is stakeholder mapping and understanding the impacts of climate change across all your stakeholders. A lot of focus at the moment, again, hot topic really, is thinking about the impact on employees, employee surveys, your customers, what their needs are, supply chain we touched on, what your competitors are doing, investors and shareholders, the wider society, and governments and regulators. So it is quite important to really think about each of your key stakeholders and how you are going to look at your risks and then assess them. We have developed a framework based on regulatory requirements in terms of materiality assessments using scenario analysis. And really what organizations need to do is look at what we call plausible, best available what-if scenarios. Risk managers can play and are playing a vital role in driving scenario selection. And it's not just about long-term planning, it's about looking at short-term business decisions around risk selection, pricing, etc., risk transfer, risk appetite. This is an output that we developed as a SIG just to highlight, I think, twisting things around, not just look at risk, look at the business decisions. And I think that's a really important factor. So what is it that you're trying to influence in the business? So are you looking at impacting changes in your business continuity plans? Are you looking at new product development? Are you looking at your investment strategy? Are you looking at HR policies? Are you looking at improvements in your capital management, risk transfer, etc.? So it's actually very important to actually look at and integrating climate change into your existing risk management process, and what areas are priority, and which ones you need to focus on in the short term, and link it back to your risk profile. Just the last slide. Strategic positioning and roadmap. A lot of focus at the moment on scope 1, 2, 3. Companies obviously need to have ambition, climate change, think about a roadmap. Here's guidance from chapter 0 for boards as to what is good business practice through to game-changing innovation. The sort of things that you organization can be thinking of doing in terms of looking at the identifying roadmap around climate change and ambition and reducing emissions. And just in terms of next steps for the IRM, we're obviously looking to publish our practitioner's guide. We're setting up a new working group to support the next phases of the guide and research, developing, modifying our climate change risk management training proposition, And that's, you know, so it's an iterative process, obviously trying to build on what the success of the first course we launched. We are building further relationships with the academic institutions, and really investigating further opportunities to collaborate with other SIGs and RIGs around not just the UK but globally, and to, you know, to help make a difference. And, you know, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, you know, or you want to contact the IRM, myself, talk about the SIG, more than happy to share and get you involved if you're interested in joining. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So I'm just going to change over slides. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So basically, first of all, I think the key thing to say is that the slides will be put on the RIG IRM page, so everyone will have access to these. We have some questions today. I believe I've got the people who have asked the questions, have got their email, so we will directly write and answer those questions. We will put the responses on our LinkedIn page, the IRM group, for Scotland. So if anyone else wants to see the answers to those questions, if I can get it on the webpage, we will do that also. But firstly, just to go back, I just want to thank Ellie and David from everyone on the webinar today for your clear, insightful knowledge and kind of examples of change, climate change risk, and sharing all the free resources that I'm pretty sure not everyone knew was there in terms of helping the IRM members just on their journey in terms of starting to get insight into climate change if they're not already on that journey. So first of all, thank you for that. It was delightful, and David's 4 seasons in one day, I think, is definitely one of the key things that we all talk about, apart from your mic's not on just now. First of all, thank you for that. Again, Martin, thank you for coming on and sharing what is actually happening in the IRM and in that area of climate change, with, you know, having training now available, with this being one of the next big topics in risk. I think that the IRM members will be delighted with that. In terms of, we did get a question around about, you know, where do you start in terms of trying to find the information, and I think you kind of clearly went through that at the end. The IRM have lots of resources, and on the resources page and with the new information thought leadership documents that are coming out will inevitably help with that. Just before I go, I just wanted to, if I can get my screen to move, there will be a new network newsletter coming out in July, so that will come straight to all the RIGs. And as well as that, I also have the new event that will come in the 27th of August, which is UNICEF. We have Mind Matter Scotland and the charity SIG. So if it will be available next week to register. But conscious of time, thank you everyone for joining us. As I said, we'll get the questions answered, and we will see you at the next event. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.